In the previous video, we demonstrated how concurrency exception happens and how we can resolve the concurrency exception by using optimistic locking. Now, once the concurrency exception happens, the end user would like to take some actions. Now remember, when concurrency exception happens, the data on the server, that is database, and on the client, that is the entity framework objects, don't match. So the user would like to do one of the two things. He would like to update his data, that is the client data, to the database, that is to the store, or probably he would like to get the recent data into his client, that is the entity framework object. Now as a developer, you would have to write a lot of code in order to implement both of these scenarios. But thanks to entity framework, what we need to do is we need to write just couple of lines of code. Okay, in entity framework, if you want to send the data from the client to the database, we need to use something called as Clientwins. If you want to get the data from the database to the entity framework object, we need to use something called as the storewins. So let's see how we can go and implement Clientwins and storewins in entity framework. So here is the same code which I've discussed in the previous video. So when the exception happens in this context.saveChanges, we have actually caught that exception. So whatever Clientwins or storewins code we need to write in this catch exception area, right? So here what we need to do is, in order to, let's say we want to implement Clientwins, so we need to do something like this. So we need to use the iObjectContext adapter interface. So in order to use the iObjectContext adapter interface, we need to ensure that we import system.data.entity.infrastructure. So let's go ahead and import this namespace. So you can see that the namespace has been imported here. And over here, we need to go and typecast the context object. So I'll say here context dot context, dot. So you can see that we have an object context property here, or object here I'll say, and in that we have a nice method called as refresh. Okay, let me just go and just put indent over here so that we can read the code properly. So dot refresh. Now how do you want the refresh to be? So do you want to refresh Clientwins or do you want to refresh storewins? So let's say we want to refresh Clientwins first, and which object do you want to refresh? So the current object is customer here, cust. So let's go ahead and refresh the cust object, and after that context dot save changes. So let me just go and run this program in a debug mode. So there it goes. Now if you see here in SQL Server, the first record what I have here is Shiv, and what I'm doing here is I'm changing that to Raju. So you can see here very quickly, I load the customer object, which is the first object, that means the first record. So you can see the first record is Shiv. I'm changing it to Raju, but I'm not calling the save changes. I go back here in order to inject concurrency exception. Let's say I change this to XYZ, right? So what will happen? In the save changes, I will get an exception, and once the exception comes in, it comes in the catch block, and in the catch block I'm saying Clientwins. In other words, at the back end, whatever data is there, currently the data is XYZ, right? So I want this XYZ data to be replaced by this new data Raju, right? Clientwins means, as I said in the previous theory part, the data what is there in the entity framework object will be sent to the customer to the database and updated. So if I say here Clientwins refresh and then I say save changes, now if I go back to my database here very quickly, if I go here now, you can see that he has updated it with Raju. So Clientwins means that the data from the entity framework side is updated to the database, and storewins means whatever data is there in the SQL Server will be refreshed back into the entity framework object. So in other words, if I just go and change this to storewins, so let me go the other way around. So let me say I say this as storewins here. So let me also go to SQL Server here and just change this data to Shiv. Okay, right. So now what I'll do is I'll go here and run this program in a debug mode. Right, there it goes. The record is Shiv into database. I'm changing it to Raju. I'm not calling the save changes. I go here, I change this to XYZ, right? So a concurrency exception occurs. So when this save changes happens, it throws up exception, it comes here, and here I'm saying store wins. So the time I say refresh, okay, what happens is you can see that he has updated very quickly. You can see that he has updated the data from the server, to the client. So you can see that he is saying XYZ, right? So in other words, this Raju data has been overwritten by what is there in the server side, right? So this was a very simple demonstration of client wins and store wins. So in case you have an exception, a concurrency exception, you can use one of these two modes, to take action against a concurrency exception. So I hope that you enjoyed this video. In this video, we were trying to understand, how to handle concurrency exceptions and how to use store wins and client wins, depending on situation.